I want to focus a lot on healthcare because you played a pivotal role in what happened last week. And as someone who works closely with the Freedom Caucus, do you think the caucus and those who voted against the repeal of Obamacare will bear some responsibility if Obamacare implodes and people lose their coverage?
Well, I think the people that wrote Obamacare are going to bear the responsibility, and the people that voted on it, for its implosion if that were to happen. But I'm actually pretty optimistic that we can get something done. I don't think this debate is over, and I think we'll be able to repeal it, and I think we'll be able to come up with a free market solution.
I want to get back to that, but first, the president signaled that he wants to form a coalition of Democrats to work on this issue. Could that mean then, in fact, the caucus has made the president, or will make the president, shift a little bit to the left on health care? Not really what you had intended.
Well, you know, there may be parts of this bill that he needs Democrats to pass it. I have suggested that there are really three bills inside of this bill. There's the repeal bill, there's the Medicaid reform, and he can get those passed with Republicans. But then when it comes time to write a replacement, if he doesn't go with a bill like Senator Rand Paul's bill, if he does the Obamacare light version that was on the floor last week, I think he'll probably need Democrat votes for that, frankly, because it's got subsidies and bailouts for insurance companies. It's got penalties. It's got things that Republicans don't stand for. But look, he's going to have to help us repeal Obamacare before Democrats will come to the table. If their choice is Obamacare light versus Obamacare, they're going to take Obamacare. But once the law of the land is repeal, and we're back to no Obamacare, then I think the Democrats may come on board and work with him. But that's up to the president.
Now let's talk about the moving forward. You said you're hopeful. How soon do you think talks are going to resume? Do you think something's really going to happen in the next few months?
I think talks are going on right now. In fact, yesterday in our GOP conference, this was the subject of discussion, was how to move forward on health care. Frankly, we weren't talking about tax reform and we weren't talking about a wall. We were still talking about health care.
And when you say let's move toward a free market solution, can you just explain to me very simply what that would be for you? What would the plan look like if it was what you wanted it to be?
Sure. Well, we'd love the ability for people to be able to buy their insurance across state lines. We think that's one of the free market solutions. We think that people should be able to buy the amount of insurance they want. They shouldn't be required to buy things that they don't need or don't want. Those are a couple examples. I'd like to see people be able to deduct the costs of their health care, whether it's insurance or whether they're just paying for their health care. That should be tax deductible to them. It's already tax deductible for the employers. We're just trying to level the playing field there. So those are three or four things that would really bring down the price of health care and health insurance specifically. And those weren't in the bill last week. And so that's the problem that conservatives and members of the Freedom Caucus had with the bill last week. We didn't feel like there were enough reforms to bring the prices down.
All right, if you're talking about across state lines, what about taking it a step farther? And I'm not advocating this, but I've always wondered, why is healthcare treated differently than my home insurance and my car insurance? Why is it dependent on marital status? Why is it dependent on job status? Why not blow up the whole system, create a catastrophic pool like we do for flood insurance for certain things, but for the most part, everybody's in, everyone could go to their insurance agent and buy it?
You know, that's one of the things that's being talked about here among Republicans, is to create this high risk or catastrophic pool, not here at the federal level, but to give some block grants to the states so that they can help get those pools started so that you can release the rest of the health insurance market from those cost drivers, from those things that push the prices up. And I think we're really talking about two things. We're talking about health care for those who have conditions, pre-existing conditions, and then we're talking about insurance. And if we separate those two, I think the price of insurance can go way down.
All right, let's move on to some of the other things on the agenda. The fact that this did not happen last week, the stock market reacted right away and is now recovered. But the feeling was that if the president couldn't get his health care legislation passed, then he's not going to be able to do tax reform. And you already said they're not talking tax reform right now. So what do you think this means for the future of other things on the president's agenda?
Well, the biggest cost saver in the Republican plan that failed last week could actually pass, and that's the Medicaid reform portion of it. The CBO says that if we would reform the Medicaid expansion, we could save $800 billion, and that could be applied toward tax reform. So I've urged our leadership here in Congress to think about what are the elements of the bill last week that failed that actually had 218 votes. Can we put that on the floor? Can we pass that? Maybe take a smaller bite at the apple instead of trying to swallow the whole thing at one time. And that would enable us to move on to tax reform.
Do you think we're going to see significant cuts in corporate taxes this year, which is the big part of tax reform that Wall Street is looking at?
Well, you know, there's a reason tax reform hasn't been done in 30 years. It's complicated, and a lot of people are going to start screaming when you take away their deductions. What the Republicans want to do, and frankly what Americans would like to see on their own personal taxes, is to simplify the process, remove a lot of the deductions, and lower the rates. And I think we can get there. That's the goal of a Republican plan. The two most contentious issues in the Republican plan are the border adjustment tax, which is going to affect some companies more than others if they import a lot of their products that they sell. And then the other thing that's contentious in there is eliminating the tax deductibility of interest expenses. You can imagine there's some businesses that borrow a lot of money and interest is a large portion of their expenses. And the Republican plan, one of the things that's been floated is to remove the deductibility of interest expense, and that's going to be controversial too, but hopefully we won't go at tax reform like we did health care. I mean, the Republican leadership tried to shove this through in 18 days on health care. Tax reform, hopefully we'll have 3 or 4 months at least to vet these ideas with the people that are going to be affected by these laws.
Yeah, were you surprised at the speed? And the president, in effect, said when it was over last week, I'm done, I'm moving on. And now you're saying he really isn't, but the speed was a bit surprising.
Yeah. Well, the speed was surprising, but it was also disappointing. Frankly, Republicans have had 7 years to come up with a plan. And we should have, on day one, had a plan ready. We should have vetted it last year. Even as soon as the election happened, we could have been working on this in November and December. So in one sense, the speed was slow, but in the other sense, the speed was too fast in that they worked on this behind closed doors and then rolled it out and tried to shove it through in 18 days. The president said that the vote was going to happen regardless. Well, the vote didn't happen. The president said he's done negotiating. In fact, we're still negotiating. And so, you know, there were some bluffs last week. I think it was a game of chicken. I think it was two trains speeding toward each other and there was no good ending. I'm glad last week is behind us and hopefully cooler heads will prevail this week and in the weeks coming.
So what's your report card on the president after the first couple of months?
You know what? When he listens to people outside the swamp, I give him an A+. He listened to Heritage and the Federalist Society, and he came up with a great Supreme Court nominee that made everybody happy. But then when he went to shopping for a health care plan, he listened to folks inside the swamp. He listened to the GOP leadership, and frankly, I think he got misled there. So I'll still give the president a B. But I'm going to give our GOP leadership here a C-, maybe a D.
Okay. You mentioned interest rates, interest deductions for corporations. You know, people feel they're sacred for their houses as well. Could you see a plan where the GOP says home mortgage deduction no longer?
You know, I think that's one sacred cow that is not going to get gored. I think the GOP plan for personal income taxes will include the mortgage interest deduction. It's just too popular. Next to the charitable giving deduction, it's probably the most popular deduction in there. So I think you'll see that carried forward in the plan.
All right, let me move on to the House Intelligence Committee. Do you think that Devin Nunes should recuse himself from the investigation?
I don't think it makes sense to have the chairman of the Intelligence Committee recuse himself. Look, what happened last week should be a wake-up call for people who haven't been paying attention to how Americans are being surveilled in this country. Several weeks ago, people thought it was preposterous to think that maybe Donald Trump had been surveilled, and I thought it was completely possible. You are able, not you, but there are officials who are able to conduct surveillance on Americans without warrants. And I've been railing against this for 4 years. I've offered bipartisan amendments, legislation on the floor that has passed to try and rein this in, because what happens is they can investigate or conduct surveillance on foreign targets without a warrant, and I'm perfectly fine with that. They don't have constitutional rights. They're not Americans. But when you sweep up all of that data, a lot of times on the other end, there's an American. And I think it's important that we protect that other American's constitutional rights, whether it's the President of the United States, whether it's a presidential candidate, or whether it's just somebody at home, on the internet. We need to protect our rights to privacy.
Now, the president said he does not want people to take certain electronic devices on board airplanes right now if you're coming from certain predominantly Muslim nations. But we saw an attack in London, again, on a soft target with a vehicle. How can the government stay vigilant in protecting people against these attacks?
Well, we can do the common sense things. I think a lot of times we collect so much information that that our intelligence agencies are sometimes missing the forest for the trees. We got too much stuff there that we're collecting. I think it just takes hard work and due diligence. And the fact of the matter is, we're not going to be able to catch everybody.
Yeah, I mean, you saw the pat down of that child that's gone viral at the airport, and 2 minutes of screening on a child that had sensory issues. Do you think we're going kind of crazy, or do you think that that's just necessary?
I think we just need to use a little more common sense, frankly, in our surveillance and in our security.
I want to ask you, are you going to hold any town hall meetings in the near future for your constituents?
Well, you know what's interesting? I held 23 town halls last summer, and I intend to hold some this summer as well, but I didn't have more than 80 people at any of those town halls, and some of them only had 20 people. What's remarkable is that a lot of people right now are engaged because Donald Trump is the president. I'm the same congressman I was 4 years ago when I ran, and I'm taking all the same votes. But there's a level of animosity right now where I think a lot of people just want to get on camera being seen screaming and yelling at their congressman. I'm very accessible on the internet. I'm on Facebook all the time, commenting and interacting with constituents. And I plan to do that again this summer with those coffee events.
Well, it'll be interesting to see if you have more people this summer compared to last summer, if you're saying people are more engaged or are more wanting to scream at you. But will you let us know when you have those dates?
Yes.
Is there anything we didn't get to?
Oh, absolutely.
Is there something that we didn't get to today that you would like to tell us you're working on before I think we have about another minute?
Yeah, sure. Well, yesterday we passed one of my bills through committee. It calls for an audit of the Federal Reserve. I think it's very important and very timely now that the Federal Reserve has decided to raise interest rates. There's a lot of interest in my bill, and I anticipate it coming to the floor and passing over here in the House. And we'll see what it does in the Senate, but Donald Trump expressed interest in this bill during the campaign, so I think my bill that passed committee yesterday would be signed by the president if we can get it through the Senate.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. And again, let us know when you have your first date for the town hall this summer.
All right. Thank you very much.